If chocolate is truly the food of the kings, and sleep is the closest we get to timelessness, tell me, where are you currently melting into this history, and what divine hour is it gracing your presence? Comment below. Ensure the algorithm recognizes that you are settling in for an exploration of indulgence so detailed, so exhaustively minute, that the weight of historical specificity itself will lull you into a profound, peaceful stillness. We begin not with the bar, nor with the cup, but with the seed of this obsession. Our journey starts deep within the dense, humid, shadowed cradle of the equatorial rainforests of Mesoamerica, a region encompassing modern-day southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. To understand chocolate, we must first understand the life force from which it springs, the tree itself, Theobroma cacao. The name, assigned centuries later by the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus, is a fusion of Greek and Nahuatl, meaning quite literally, food of the gods. This nomenclature, far from being mere botanical flair, is a direct acknowledgement of the profound, almost sacred reverence in which this plant was held by the civilizations that first discovered its miraculous properties, millennia before any European palate was graced by its bitterness. The Theobroma cacao is not a towering monarch of the jungle canopy. Rather, it is an understory plant, preferring the filtered, dappled sunlight that penetrates the dense foliage above. It is a fragile creature requiring very specific, exacting climatic conditions that limit its successful cultivation to a narrow band, roughly 20 degrees north and south of the equator. This requirement for perpetual warmth, extremely high humidity, often exceeding 80%, consistent heavy rainfall, at least 1,500 millimeters annually, and rich, well-drained soil, often volcanic in origin, underscores the initial scarcity that defined its value. It is a fussy, demanding plant, refusing to yield its treasure to just any environment, a biological gatekeeper that ensured its early status as a luxury, reserved only for those who controlled the small, ecologically perfect zones where it could thrive. The life cycle of the cacao tree, which takes approximately 4 to 5 years to produce its first commercially viable yield, is itself a marvel of biological design. The small, 5-petaled white or pink flowers, known as micropyle, do not bloom high on the branches where the larger tropical insects might easily find them. Instead, they bud directly from the trunk and older, thick limbs, a phenomenon known as cauliflory. This unique positioning is crucial because the flowers are pollinated not by bees or butterflies, but by extremely small, highly specialized midges, often from the genus Forsythia, which thrive in the damp, decaying organic matter around the base of the tree. The pollination process is notoriously inefficient. Only a small fraction, perhaps less than 5%, of the thousands of flowers that bloom on a single tree will actually mature into the coveted, heavy cacao pods. This low rate of reproductive success is another built-in biological constraint contributing to the perennial scarcity of the cacao bean throughout history. The pod itself, which takes approximately 6 months to ripen after successful pollination, is a magnificent spectacle of nature. Ranging in color from deep green to vibrant red, yellow, or purple, and often possessing a rough-ridged surface, these pods house the true treasure, the cacao beans, nestled within a sweet, mucilaginous white pulp. A single pod typically contains between 20 and 60 beans, the raw material of chocolate. The critical, and often misunderstood step in transforming this raw, bitter seed into anything resembling the luxurious flavor we recognize is the process of fermentation. The raw bean, directly extracted from the pod, is astringent, intensely bitter, and possesses none of the rich, complex aroma that characterizes chocolate. The chemical magic must first occur. After harvest, the beans, still coated in their sticky white pulp, are heaped into piles, wooden boxes, or often wrapped in banana leaves for a period ranging from 2 to 9 days. The residual sugars in the pulp attract specialized yeasts and bacteria, which initiate a two-stage fermentation process. The yeast first converts the sugars into alcohol. Then, Acetobacter bacteria convert the alcohol into lactic and acetic acid. This intense exothermic reaction, the temperature of the heap can reach 50 degrees Celsius, is not merely about decomposition, it is about chemical transformation. The heat and acid penetrate the shell of the bean, killing the seed embryo and initiating critical enzymatic changes within the nib itself. This process breaks down complex proteins and sugars, which are the precursors to flavor. Without proper fermentation, no amount of roasting or grinding will yield chocolate. This ancient, precise, and entirely natural process, discovered millennia ago by Mesoamerican peoples, is arguably the first critical technological hurdle in the history of chocolate production. A hurdle that was mastered long before the advent of metallurgical or mechanical engineering. The earliest conclusive archaeological evidence of this mastery dates back astonishingly far, predating the rise of both the Maya and the Aztecs. Excavations at the ancient Mochaya sites in Soconusco, Chiapas, Mexico, specifically at a site called Paso de la Amada, have yielded pottery fragments dating back to approximately 1900 BCE. Residue analysis of these ceramics using techniques that identify theobromine, a unique alkaloid marker of cacao, confirmed that these early societies were processing and consuming cacao beverages. This places the consumption of chocolate in the Olmec or pre-Olmec period, demonstrating that this specialized, technically demanding process of harvest and fermentation was one of the foundational cultural practices of early Mesoamerican civilization. The Olmec civilization, which flourished along the Gulf Coast of Mexico from about 1500 BCE, are often cited as the mother culture of Mesoamerica, pioneering many of the calendrical, artistic, and religious traditions later adopted by the Maya and Aztec. It is within this formative period that cacao transitioned from a mere wild fruit to a controlled, culturally significant commodity. The discovery that the bitter seeds, once fermented, dried, and ground, could produce a potent, stimulating, and satisfying beverage represented a monumental leap in culinary technology. For the Olmecs and their successors, the use of cacao was almost certainly ritualistic before it was purely recreational. The sheer difficulty of the process, the scarcity of the beans, and the stimulating properties of the final drink, rich in theobromine and caffeine, lent it an inherent connection to the divine, a substance capable of altering consciousness or aiding communication with the spirit world. Cacao was not consumed casually. It was a potent elixir tied to ceremonies of elite status, offerings to the gods, and possibly early medicinal applications. The transition of the plant from the rainforest floor to the center of ritual life required centuries of careful observation, refinement of processing techniques, and the development of specialized ceramic vessels designed specifically to hold and serve the thick, often frothy beverage. This early history establishes chocolate not as a confection, but as a powerfully charged cultural object, a complex, labor-intensive drink of immense symbolic power, reserved for the ruling and priestly classes. The enduring scarcity imposed by the finicky nature of the Theobroma cacao tree ensured that from its earliest use, chocolate was indelibly stamped with the mark of luxury and exclusivity, a legacy that would follow it across oceans and millennia. The profound commitment required to maintain and harvest this demanding plant across the vast, scattered tropical landscapes required the development of extensive trade networks even in the nascent stages of Mesoamerican civilization, laying the economic groundwork for the empires that would eventually elevate chocolate to the status of liquid gold. The techniques employed by these early cultures to coax the intense flavors from the fermented beans are themselves worthy of exhaustive contemplation, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of chemistry and thermal processing centuries ahead of comparable European culinary practices. Once the fermentation was complete, having broken down the initial bitterness and initiated the flavor precursors, the beans required meticulous drying, usually in the tropical sun, a process that reduced moisture content drastically to prevent mold and ensure long-term storage stability. Only then came the roasting, perhaps the second most critical step after fermentation. Roasting, conducted over low fires, or more commonly, on earthenware griddles, served multiple crucial purposes. Firstly, it completed the flavor development process, triggering the complex Maillard reaction, which is responsible for the deep, nutty, roasted notes that define chocolate's aroma. This reaction converts the flavor precursors developed during fermentation into the hundreds of volatile aromatic compounds that give chocolate its complexity. Secondly, roasting effectively separated the outer shell, the husk, from the inner kernel, the nib, making the bean easily peelable. Thirdly, and of immense practical importance, roasting slightly reduced the fat content of the nibs, turning the solid fat into a liquid, which aided significantly in the grinding process that followed. The duration and temperature of the roast were highly controlled variables, refined over centuries by the Olmec and Mayan priests and food preparers, a testament to their refined sensory appreciation and metallurgical capabilities with their simple ceramic tools. The resulting nibs, now roasted and winnowed, were still not chocolate. They were the raw material. The transformation required the immense labor of grinding. This was accomplished using the metat, a traditional stone grinding slab, and the mano, a heavy stone rolling pin. This grinding was performed by hand, often by specialized women, requiring intense physical effort over extended periods. The friction generated by the stone-on-stone action, combined with the inherent fat content of the nib, cacao beans are about 50–60% cocoa butter, caused the ground nibs to heat up and transition into a thick, oily liquid paste, what we now call chocolate liquor, though it contains no alcohol. This liquor was the very essence of the ancient beverage. It was then usually mixed with water, various spices, chili peppers, annatto seed for color, vanilla or allspice, and often cornmeal or honey. The result was a thick, highly potent drink, usually served warm or at room temperature, distinctively bitter, heavily spiced, and often topped with a signature froth, achieved by pouring the liquid back and forth between vessels from a great height. The preparation process alone underscores the immense value of the resulting drink. It was a beverage of labor and scarcity, consumed slowly and deliberately, far removed from the mass-produced sugary sweetness of the modern chocolate bar. The very existence of this complex multi-stage process, rooted in deep botanical knowledge and advanced culinary technique dating back nearly 4 millennia, ensures that the history of chocolate is fundamentally the history of meticulous, ritualized human ingenuity applied to a stubborn natural resource. The transition from the Olmec to the Maya, and the subsequent elaboration of cacao's role, provides a clear view into the formalization of its sacred and economic standing. The Mayan civilization, flourishing from roughly 250 CE to 900 CE, left behind the most extensive and detailed record of cacao use. Cacao was woven into the very fabric of their religion, their politics, and their economy. Their creation myths, notably those recorded in the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiche Maya, often feature cacao prominently, linking its consumption and its very existence to the gods and to the origins of human life itself. Cacao beans were used in virtually every significant life event: birth, baptism, marriage, and death. Funerary urns often contained cacao beans or remnants of the prepared drink, intended to provide sustenance and wealth in the afterlife. The consumption of the bitter beverage was inextricably linked to royal ceremony, dynastic marriages, and peace treaties. When one nobleman negotiated with another, the conclusion of the treaty was often sealed by the sharing of a cup of chocolatl. This profound cultural integration ensured that the control of cacao production and distribution became a defining characteristic of political and economic power within the Mayan city-states. While gold and silver were unknown in Mesoamerica, cacao beans filled the void as the most portable, recognizable, and durable form of currency, capable of settling both minor daily transactions and major interstate tribute payments. The cacao bean was a unit of account, a medium of exchange, and a powerful store of value, the ultimate historical testament to the bean's perfection as a commodity currency, sharing many of the desirable qualities we discussed in our prior discourse on the history of money, particularly its difficulty to counterfeit and its high value-to-weight ratio. The economic power derived from controlling the flow of this bitter aromatic bean was the engine that helped finance the grandeur and the eventual warfare between the great Mayan centers, a testament to the fact that even the most sacred of substances can become the fuel of geopolitical ambition. The sheer volume of cultural and linguistic evidence left by the Maya regarding cacao is overwhelming. Their writing system, a sophisticated combination of logograms and phonetic syllables, features multiple glyphs specifically dedicated to the cacao tree, the bean, the pod, the various processing stages, and the resulting drink. This dedicated lexicography indicates a profound, multi-layered engagement with the substance. Furthermore, Mayan artistry provides detailed pictorial evidence. We see rulers and high-status individuals holding foam-topped cups of the drink, often depicted during ceremonial feasts or political assemblies. The vessels themselves became works of art, highly decorated ceramic cylinders designed specifically to enhance the ritual of drinking. These artifacts serve as tangible proof that the value of cacao was amplified not just by its biological scarcity, but by the elaborate cultural and artistic investment poured into its presentation and consumption. The Mayan era cemented chocolate's status. It was wealth to be saved, tribute to be paid, medicine to be administered, and a divine link to be maintained. Its economic function never fully detached from its sacred identity, providing a unique historical precedent where currency maintained an intrinsic ritualistic power, a dual role that would be entirely lost when the bean finally crossed the Atlantic. The eventual adoption and elevation of cacao by the Aztec Empire, beginning in the 14th century and culminating just before the arrival of the Europeans, provides the final, most formalized phase of Mesoamerican chocolate history. The Aztecs, a powerful, militaristic society centered in the highland valley of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, modern Mexico City, existed geographically outside the primary cacao-growing regions, which remained the tropical lowlands. This ecological separation amplified cacao's status, transforming it from a locally grown luxury into a rare, highly strategic imported commodity, acquired almost entirely through conquest and punitive tribute systems. The Aztec economy did not rely on coinage as we understand it, but rather employed a complex system of barter, supplemented by standardized commodity money, with the cacao bean sitting at the very apex of this monetary hierarchy. The beans served as the highest denomination currency, used to purchase complex goods, pay for labor, or settle large debts. Detailed tribute lists recorded in the Codex Mendoza show that conquered provinces were forced to supply specific, massive quantities of cacao beans to the Aztec capital annually, cementing the bean's role as the lifeblood of the imperial treasury. This scarcity, enforced by the Aztec imperial structure, meant that the average citizen rarely, if ever, consumed the pure chocolatol. It was reserved exclusively for the pipiltin, the nobility, the military elite, as a fortifying ration before and after battle, the priesthood, and successful long-distance merchants, pochtesa. The Emperor Montezuma II himself was legendary for his consumption habits, reportedly drinking massive quantities of the foamy, bitter, chili-infused beverage daily from golden goblets, consuming the stimulating drink as a marker of his divine status and power. The drink was considered a powerful, invigorating tonic, capable of sustaining a man through a day's march without additional food, and an aphrodisiac, further cementing its connection to power and vitality. The deliberate restriction of the consumption of chocolate to the elite class served a crucial sociological function. It was a visible, costly, and potent symbol of the hierarchical distance between the ruling class and the commoner. To drink chocolatol was to literally ingest the power derived from the imperial tribute system. This context, the rarity, the ritual, the economic function, and the political power, is the crucial backdrop against which the European encounter takes place. An encounter that would shatter the indigenous consumption rituals and eventually transform this sacred currency into a global, democratic confection. The meticulous organization and economic significance placed upon the cacao bean by the Aztec Empire cannot be overstated, extending even into detailed systems of quality control and value assessment. The beans used for currency were not just haphazardly counted, they were categorized, and their market value fluctuated based on size, integrity, and origin. merchants understood the sophisticated system of price points. A single, good-quality bean might buy a tomato, while a turkey egg might cost 3 beans, and a small rabbit required 10. At the higher end, a well-made canoe, or the services of a full day's labor could cost a standardized quantity of 100 beans. This elaborate functional system was, however, continuously threatened by early forms of currency manipulation and fraud. The high value of the bean led to the development of sophisticated counterfeiting techniques, where commoners would attempt to pass off inferior or doctored beans, sometimes hollowing out the shell and filling it with clay, or using beans from other less valuable species. Such practices necessitated strict vigilance and enforcement by the Pochtesa, the merchant guilds who often operated as trade regulators and law enforcement for the empire's economic life. The very need for regulation, inspection, and the maintenance of a fixed exchange rate demonstrates the full maturation of the cacao bean as a functioning, high-value currency. When Hernán Cortés and his Spanish conquistadors first arrived in Tenochtitlan in 1519, they were immediately struck by the strange customs surrounding this bitter dark drink, and the astonishing fact that the local population treated the common bean as a unit of value greater than the gold that the Europeans relentlessly sought. Cortés himself observed the systematic use of cacao as money and the ritualistic consumption by Montezuma. His initial reaction, and that of his men, was one of curiosity mixed with disdain. The drink was too bitter, too heavily spiced with chili, and its frothy texture, often achieved by blowing air through reeds or pouring from height, was alien to the European palate accustomed to wine or water. The Spaniards initially viewed the bean as an interesting, if peculiar, local curiosity, a form of exotic nourishment. However, Cortés, always the strategist, quickly recognized the dual utility of cacao, its high nutritional and stimulating properties, making it an excellent, non-perishable ration for his troops on long marches, and its established immense value as a medium of exchange within the local economy. It was this second utility, cacao as currency, that ensured its preservation and eventual passage to Europe. While the Spaniards melted down every golden artifact they could find, they meticulously accumulated stores of cacao beans, recognizing their power to purchase necessary provisions, labor, and information from the indigenous populations who still revered and relied upon the bean for their economic structure. Cortés wrote back to King Charles V, detailing the plant's dual nature as a strange but potent beverage and a high-value currency, referring to it as the almendra, or almond. This pragmatic observation, rooted in economic necessity rather than culinary appreciation, sealed the fate of cacao. It transitioned from a sacred local currency to an important strategic commodity for the conquering foreign power, ensuring that the seeds and the ancient complex processing knowledge were transported back across the vast, perilous Atlantic Ocean, setting the stage for chocolate's eventual transformation from a bitter Aztec elixir into a global, sweetened European luxury, a metamorphosis that required centuries of adaptation and refinement to the foreign palate, marking the beginning of the second, equally long and transformative phase of its history. The journey across the Atlantic, initiated shortly after the conquest of the Aztec Empire, marks the moment the history of chocolate transitioned from a Mesoamerican cultural story to a global economic and geopolitical narrative. The initial shipments of cacao beans to Spain in the 1520s were primarily exploratory. The beans themselves were not immediately popular. The original Aztec preparation, thick, cold, unsweetened, and highly spiced with chili and herbs, was thoroughly unsuited to the Spanish palate, which prized sweetness and warmth. For the first 50 to 75 years following its introduction, cacao remained a strange, obscure import, treated more as a medicinal curiosity or an anthropological specimen than as a serious foodstuff. It was the Jesuit priests and the cloistered nuns in New Spain, Mexico, who became the crucial, unheralded innovators in this period of transition. These religious orders, living in relative isolation in the colonies, were the ones who first systematically adapted the preparation techniques to European tastes, often incorporating the bean into their daily routines or using it as a trading commodity. The transformation was revolutionary yet simple, the substitution of cane sugar for chili peppers. Spain had already established robust sugarcane plantations in its colonies and the Canary Islands. The indigenous concept of combining the stimulant properties of cacao with a strong, stabilizing flavor, the chili, was retained, but the chili was replaced by the European obsession with sweetness. They also incorporated traditional European aromatics like cinnamon, anise, and above all, vanilla, a powerful, aromatic ingredient native to Mesoamerica, but entirely unfamiliar to European consumers before its discovery. This seemingly small alteration, the introduction of sugar and heat, fundamentally changed the profile of chocolate, rendering it palatable and eventually addictive to the European upper class. The drink, now served warm, thick, and sweet, was a profound luxury that appealed directly to the aristocracy's penchant for exotic, costly imports that carried an air of mystery and colonial adventure. The Spanish crown, recognizing the immense potential value and the strategic importance of this unique, stimulating commodity, successfully maintained a tight monopoly over the production and trade of cacao for nearly a century. This monopoly was enforced through strict control over the colonial ports and the highly secretive nature of the Spanish court. Cacao became Spain's secret weapon of indulgence. It was initially confined to the royal court and the highest ranks of the clergy, where its consumption was a discreet, elaborate, and deeply fashionable ritual. Spanish noblewomen, known for their strict adherence to custom and luxury, were particularly enamored, bringing their specialized chocolate pots, chocolateras, and swirling whisks, molinillos, with them everywhere, even to Mass. This consumption by the elite created an intense, almost religious fervor around the beverage within Spain, solidifying its status as a high society luxury and ensuring that its value remained exceptionally high. The secrecy surrounding the sourcing and processing knowledge was paramount, as Spain sought to protect its economic advantage from its aggressive European rivals, the English, French, and Dutch, who were perpetually seeking ways to breach the Spanish colonial trade routes and acquire the valuable beans for themselves. The introduction of chocolate into the various European courts was achieved not through direct trade, but through the subtle, powerful mechanisms of diplomacy, royal intermarriage, and, inevitably, smuggling. The official breach of the Spanish monopoly is often attributed to the marriage of the Spanish Infanta Maria Teresa to Louis XIV of France in 1660. As part of her dowry and household goods, Maria Teresa brought a copious supply of cacao and the Spanish knowledge of its preparation to the French court at Versailles. The French aristocracy, already masters of culinary extravagance and sophisticated social ritual, immediately embraced the decadent drink. It quickly became the fashionable rage, not just for its flavor, but for its purported medicinal benefits. It was claimed to cure illnesses, settle stomachs, and most importantly, in the context of the libertine French court, act as a potent aphrodisiac, a reputation carried over directly from its Aztec origins. The spread of chocolate across Europe accelerated rapidly in the latter half of the 17th century. From France, it moved quickly to Italy, carried by savvy diplomats and merchants. The Italians, with their long-established culinary traditions and their early engagement with coffee and sugar imports via Venice and Genoa, were quick to integrate chocolate into their own urban social scene. From Italy, it traveled north to England and the Netherlands, carried by merchant ships and colonial adventurers. Crucially, the Dutch, with their immense naval power and sophisticated global trading networks, became the primary force to finally and irrevocably shatter the Spanish monopoly. The Dutch established highly efficient cacao plantations in their colonies in South America, particularly in Suriname and later in Southeast Asia, ensuring a reliable and eventually cheaper supply that bypassed Spanish control entirely. By the turn of the 18th century, cacao was no longer an exotic secret. It was a global commodity, still expensive, but accessible enough to move beyond the royal palaces and into the bustling social institutions of the rapidly industrializing European capitals, the chocolate houses. The establishment of chocolate houses across London, Paris, and Amsterdam in the late 17th and 18th centuries marked the next pivotal transformation of chocolate, positioning it not just as a beverage, but as the foundation of a new social and political culture. The chocolate house was the rival and, often, the more exclusive counterpart to the burgeoning coffee house. Coffee houses were typically loud, democratic, and intellectually charged. They were the domain of merchants, writers, and revolutionaries. Chocolate houses, conversely, tended to be quieter, more exclusive, and often catered specifically to the aristocratic and political elite. In London, famed institutions like White's and the Cocoa Tree were places where fortunes were made and lost, political alliances were forged, and the high society of the day conducted its serious business and gossip. The sheer cost of the cacao bean and the sugar required to prepare the drink ensured that the clientele remained decidedly high status. This social integration was essential because it firmly established chocolate as the drink of the enlightened elite. A stimulant, yes, but a civilized, refined stimulant, distinct from the rougher, more ubiquitous coffee or the heavy consumption of ale and spirits. Chocolate was intellectually stimulating without being intoxicating, making it the perfect fuel for the nascent Enlightenment society. The atmosphere of these chocolate houses fostered political discourse, leading many of them to evolve into the earliest forms of political clubs and stock exchanges. Lloyd's of London, the massive insurance market, famously began its life not as an insurance office, but as a coffee house frequented by ship captains and financiers. Similarly, major political factions often had their origins in these chocolate-infused salons. The history of chocolate, therefore, is intricately tied not just to culinary history, but to the very genesis of modern financial institutions and parliamentary democracy in Europe. This period, spanning the late 17th and the 18th centuries, saw chocolate successfully integrate into the highest levels of European society, completing its transformation from sacred currency to status-defining, sweetened beverage, poised now for the final, monumental leap into the age of industrial mass production. The theological debate surrounding chocolate during its initial centuries in Europe, particularly within the powerful structures of the Catholic Church, offers a fascinating and extremely detailed illustration of how a foreign foodstuff can challenge established religious doctrine, a debate that underscores the drink's perceived potency and unique composition. The issue centered entirely on the observance of Lent and other periods of religious fasting. Since the Middle Ages, the Church had established strict rules regarding sustenance. During fasts, meat and, often, dairy products were strictly prohibited. The debate was simply this: was the thick, rich, fortifying liquid known as chocolate considered a food, thus prohibited during fasts, or merely a beverage, which was generally permissible? Given that early chocolate was often mixed with spices, cornmeal, and sometimes even eggs or wine to enhance its richness, the lines were considerably blurred. The consumption of chocolate became a matter of intense clerical controversy, particularly in the wealthy colonial administrative centers like Chiapas in Mexico, where access to the drink was ubiquitous even among the local clergy. The argument against chocolate was rooted in its restorative qualities. Proponents of prohibition argued that because the drink was so substantial, so rich in fats, cocoa butter, and so stimulating, it effectively broke the spirit of the fast, providing the consumer with full energy and satisfaction, thus nullifying the intended penitential aspect of Lenten sacrifice. The most notable clerical opposition came from bishops and priests in New Spain, who saw the rich consumption habits of the local elite, even during holy periods, as an indication of moral laxity enabled by this foreign substance. However, the tide was consistently turned by the powerful arguments made by the Jesuits, a highly influential and globally connected religious order that had vested interests in the successful commerce of their colonial missions, many of which had adopted cacao cultivation. The Jesuit argument was meticulously theological and physiological. They argued that because chocolate was a liquid, it did not fulfill the requirements of traditional food, which was solid. Furthermore, they emphasized its cold, or at least tepid preparation in some forms, which further distanced it from being considered a warm comfort food. Most effectively, they utilized the traditional classification of wine and water, arguing that chocolate was simply another specialized beverage. The debate was finally settled by a series of papal rulings and influential treatises. The most decisive moment occurred when a pope, facing this constant heated question, reportedly declared, after tasting the prepared drink, that since the beverage did not break the fast, it was permissible. The phrase, often paraphrased as liquidum non frangit jejunum, a liquid does not break the fast, became the canonical justification that allowed high society consumption to continue uninterrupted, even during the most austere religious periods. This papal endorsement, driven partly by Jesuit lobbying and the sheer desirability of the substance, provided a massive, unintended cultural victory for chocolate, legitimizing its pervasive presence in European life and guaranteeing its consumption across all seasons, religious or otherwise, further ensuring its massive economic viability. The successful integration of chocolate into European consumption inevitably led to the rapid escalation of the demands placed upon the cultivation regions. The transition from the small, ecologically sensitive, indigenous milpa farming techniques to large-scale, profit-driven plantation agriculture during the 17th and 18th centuries marks the darkest and most economically vital period in chocolate's history. The fussy Theobroma cacao tree, which thrives best when intercropped with other shade-providing jungle trees, was forcibly converted into a monoculture crop across massive tracts of land in the Spanish, French, and Portuguese colonies, particularly in the Caribbean, Venezuela, Ecuador, and later Brazil. This large-scale cultivation was made economically viable only through the brutal efficiency of the transatlantic slave trade. Cacao, like sugar and tobacco, became a classic slave crop. The demanding labor required, from clearing the dense rainforest understory to the delicate, manual labor of harvesting, pod breaking, fermenting, and drying, fell entirely upon enslaved Africans and, in some regions, forced indigenous labor. The rapid expansion of European taste directly translated into the suffering and exploitation of millions in the colonial world. Regions like the Venezuelan coast, which produced the highly prized Criollo beans, became critical flashpoints in the global competition for colonial wealth, with European powers fighting proxy wars and engaging in outright piracy to secure control over these valuable agricultural lands and their labor force. The high demand for cacao meant that even relatively marginal lands were pushed into production, sometimes leading to environmental degradation and a lowering of the overall quality of the beans, which necessitated the eventual introduction of hardier, higher-yielding, but less flavorful varietals like Forastero to meet the insatiable European appetite. The paradox of chocolate's history is never more stark than during this plantation era. The ultimate symbol of civilized luxury and courtly refinement in Europe was directly financed and maintained by the most barbaric system of forced labor in the colonies. The price of an elegant cup of spiced, warm chocolate in a London or Paris chocolate house included the immense human cost of the Atlantic crossing and the ceaseless, brutal labor under the tropical sun. The abolitionist movements of the 19th century, particularly in Britain, would eventually target these slave-produced commodities, forcing a reckoning with the ethical cost of consumption. However, for 2 centuries, the wealth generated by the chocolate trade was enormous, enriching colonial powers, fueling the expansion of merchant classes, and establishing the complex, extractive global supply chain that defines the industry even today. The systemic reliance on cheap, non-consensual labor for chocolate production would haunt the industry long after legal slavery was abolished, manifesting in later controversies over indentured servitude and, tragically, modern child labor practices in West Africa, demonstrating the deeply rooted ethical complexity embedded within the history of this food of the gods. The transition from colonial plantation economies to the age of industrialization in the 19th century demanded a final, radical technological shift in how chocolate was processed. For centuries, the entire operation, roasting, shelling, and stone grinding the nibs into the viscous chocolate liquor, was slow, noisy, and inefficient, powered by human labor or simple water-driven stone mills. This restricted chocolate primarily to beverages and specialized confectionery items sold through apothecaries and elite grocers. The critical breakthrough required to democratize chocolate, transforming it from a thick, elite drink into the solid, affordable bar we recognize, did not come from an inventor of confectionery, but from a Dutch chemist and entrepreneur named Coenraad Johannes van Houten. Van Houten's innovation in 1828 was not about making a new flavor, but about solving a purely mechanical and chemical problem: the excess fat content. As noted, cacao beans contain a massive amount of fat, cocoa butter, which makes the resulting liquid chocolate liquor thick, oily, and difficult to mix smoothly into drinks without separating, and extremely prone to going rancid when packaged. Van Houten designed and patented a massive hydraulic press, a machine capable of exerting extreme pressure on the warmed chocolate liquor. This press efficiently squeezed out approximately half of the naturally occurring cocoa butter, leaving behind a hard, dry cake that was easily pulverized into a fine, highly stable powder. This powdered cocoa was a revelation. It mixed instantly and smoothly with hot water or milk, creating a much lighter, more palatable and significantly cheaper beverage base than the heavy, full-fat chocolate liquor. Furthermore, the removal of the fat content extended the shelf life of the resulting powder exponentially. The secondary product of this process, the extracted cocoa butter, initially seemed like waste, a valuable byproduct to be sold to the cosmetic and pharmaceutical industries. However, this pure, bland, highly stable fat proved to be the second essential ingredient in the coming chocolate revolution. Prior to Van Houten, creating solid chocolate meant simply letting the whole, full-fat chocolate liquor cool and solidify. This resulted in a grainy, brittle, and highly unstable product that was unpleasant to eat. The ability to reintroduce the extracted cocoa butter selectively into the dried cocoa powder or into the remaining chocolate liquor allowed manufacturers to control the texture and melting point with unprecedented precision. This scientific mastery over the fat content was the single most important prerequisite for the creation of the modern chocolate bar. Without the Van Houten press, solid chocolate confectionery would have remained an impossible dream, perpetually grainy and unstable. This chemical intervention effectively marked the end of the ancient ritualistic consumption method and ushered in the modern, industrialized, and global era of chocolate consumption, pivoting its history from the cup to the bar and from the elite palace to the mass consumer market. The patent eventually expired, and the Dutch process, often involving treating the cocoa powder with alkaline salts to deepen the color and mellow the acidity, known as Dutching, was swiftly adopted across Europe, fueling the rise of the great chocolate manufacturing houses of the Victorian era. The history of chocolate, therefore, is ultimately a long, deliberate march toward textural refinement, driven by a series of technological breakthroughs that overcame the limitations imposed by the natural biology of the Theobroma cacao bean. The Lydian coin standardized value, the Van Houten press standardized texture, making mass consumption possible and paving the way for the confectionery giants of the 20th century. The silence around us now mirrors the deep quiet of the factory floors after the close of the day, where the complex machinery awaits its next cycle of transformation, perpetually reshaping this ancient being into new, profitable, and globally dominant forms. The long history continues, stretching from the muddy banks of the Olmec Delta to the shining, sterile production lines of modern industrial giants. The mechanical and chemical transformation achieved by Van Houten in 1828 provided the raw ingredients for the solid chocolate revolution, but it was the systematic ingenuity of the Swiss confectioners in the mid-19th century that finally perfected the process, transforming the hard, brittle cocoa cake into the smooth, melt-in-your-mouth experience that became universally desirable. Switzerland, ironically a land entirely unsuitable for cacao cultivation, became the world capital of fine chocolate manufacturing, leveraging its expertise in dairy processing and precision engineering. The key to this next phase of innovation lay in two distinct yet complementary breakthroughs: the introduction of milk powder and the invention of the conching machine. The creation of milk chocolate is inextricably linked to the dense network of inventive collaboration and competition in the small Swiss town of Vevey. In the 1870s, Daniel Peter, a candle maker turned chocolatier, was desperately seeking a way to overcome the inherent bitterness and astringency of even the Dutch processed chocolate. He realized that milk, beyond just adding sweetness and flavor, would temper the strong, earthy notes of the cocoa mass. However, simply adding fresh milk to chocolate liquor caused immediate problems. The high water content of fresh milk encouraged mold, dramatically shortened shelf life, and created a lumpy, highly unstable final product. Peter required a milk source with zero moisture content. This problem was solved by his neighbor, Henri Nestlé, who had recently perfected a method for commercially producing and marketing powdered condensed milk, primarily as an infant food staple. In 1875, after years of experimentation, Peter successfully combined cocoa mass, cocoa butter, sugar, and Nestlé's milk powder, creating the world's first marketable milk chocolate. This invention was not merely a new flavor. It was a fundamental redefinition of chocolate, moving it decisively away from its original dark, bitter identity and cementing its place as a mass-market sweet confection. Milk chocolate rapidly became the dominant form of consumption worldwide, appealing to a far broader and younger audience than the elite, bitter drinks of old. Simultaneously, the second crucial mechanical innovation revolutionized texture. Early solid chocolate, even with added cocoa butter, suffered from a grainy, rough mouthfeel due to microscopic, uneven cocoa particles. The breakthrough came from Rudolf Lindt in Bern, Switzerland, in 1879, with the accidental, or intentional, depending on the historical account, invention of the conching machine. The conche, named for its original shape resembling a conch shell, is essentially a longitudinal trough with granite rollers that intensely knead, agitate, and aerate the mixed chocolate mass, cocoa solids, cocoa butter, sugar, and milk powder, for periods ranging from hours to, in high-end operations, several days. This prolonged, intense churning serves two vital functions: physical and chemical. Physically, it reduces the size of all solid particles, sugar and cocoa solids, to an extremely fine size, typically less than 30 micrometers, a dimension small enough to prevent the tongue from perceiving grittiness. Chemically, the friction and aeration drive off volatile, unwanted acidic and bitter flavors, the remnants of the fermentation and roasting processes, through evaporation. The result is the signature smooth, melt-in-your-mouth texture and the refined, rounded flavor profile that defines high-quality chocolate. The conch, more than any other machine, elevated chocolate from a simple confection to a sophisticated product requiring precision engineering and sustained process control, completing the final industrial step necessary for global dominance. The combination of the Van Houten press, the Peter Nestlé milk powder, and Lindt's conch transformed chocolate from an artisanal, localized product into a highly scalable, globally tradable, industrial commodity. The late 19th century saw the rapid establishment of massive chocolate factories across Europe and the United States. Cadbury, Fry, Rowntree, UK, Lindt, Peter, Suchard, Switzerland, and Hershey, US. This industrial scale required a corresponding reorganization of the global supply chain. The initial focus shifted from the diminishing returns of the original Mesoamerican colonies to the vastly greater, newly opened plantation lands of West Africa, specifically the colonies in the Gold Coast, Ghana, and Côte d'Ivoire. West Africa presented the ideal combination of climate, vast undeveloped land, and, crucially, access to incredibly cheap labor, often organized through colonial forced labor systems or later, through small, intensely competitive smallholder farming, supported by oppressive colonial trade policies. The beans grown here were predominantly the hardier, high-yielding Forastero varietal, which, though less complex in flavor than the rare Criollo, were perfectly suited for the industrial, high-volume production of milk chocolate, where the robust flavors were mellowed by sugar and milk. This shift established the modern geopolitical reality of the cocoa trade. The overwhelming majority of the world's raw cocoa beans, today over 70%, are produced by small, economically vulnerable farmers in West Africa, while the vast majority of the wealth, processing, marketing, and consumption occurs in the developed nations of the West. This enduring geographical disparity is the legacy of the late 19th century industrial drive for scale and low cost, perpetuating the extractive economic model first established during the colonial slave era. The history of chocolate in the 20th century became entirely intertwined with the history of modern mass marketing and warfare. In the United States, Milton S. Hershey capitalized brilliantly on the low cost of the new industrial cocoa process. Hershey was not an innovator in flavor or texture. His genius lay in standardization, efficiency, and scale. He built his entire town around his immense factory in Pennsylvania, creating an integrated, self-sufficient production hub. His core strategy was making chocolate affordable and ubiquitous, the democratization of chocolate. The iconic Hershey's Milk chocolate bar, wrapped in its simple silver foil, became a symbol of American accessibility and mass production, sold for just 5 cents. By the 1920s, chocolate was no longer just a luxury item. It was a common treat, an accessible indulgence woven into the fabric of American childhood. The 2 world wars provided an unexpected, massive boost to chocolate's global presence and established it firmly in the military-industrial complex. During both conflicts, chocolate was deemed an essential morale booster and a non-perishable, high-energy ration for soldiers. Hershey, in particular, famously collaborated with the U.S. Army to develop the D ration during World War II, a highly caloric, extreme heat-resistant, deliberately less palatable chocolate bar designed specifically to be carried as an emergency survival food, consumed only when absolutely necessary. This mass distribution of American-made chocolate to millions of soldiers across Europe and the Pacific introduced the modern sugary confection to populations who had previously only encountered the traditional, often high-end European brands. This military exposure cemented chocolate's global familiarity and established the United States as a primary influence in post-war chocolate consumption patterns, further pushing the global market toward standardized, heavily sweetened milk chocolate products. The post-war era, characterized by economic boom and the rise of the consumer culture, saw chocolate marketing evolve into a sophisticated, multi-billion-dollar psychological operation. No longer was chocolate marketed as a medicinal tonic, as it was in the 18th century, or a symbol of high society. It became a vessel for immediate gratification, comfort, and emotional reward. Advertising campaigns linked chocolate to love, holidays, Easter, Christmas, Valentine's Day, and childhood nostalgia. The development of complex filled chocolates, molded shapes, and novel packaging techniques transformed the industry into a creative battleground for consumer attention. This intense focus on branding and marketing created a massive disconnect between the final, highly processed product and its troubled remote origin. The consumer rarely thought about the cacao tree, the fermentation process, or the struggling West African farmer. They simply thought of the brand's promise of smooth, sweet indulgence, a deliberate psychological simplification necessary for maintaining industrial scale and maximizing profit margins. The 20th century history of chocolate is thus characterized by two parallel, widening narratives. The story of increasing technological sophistication and massive wealth generation in the consuming nations, and the story of deepening economic vulnerability and environmental strain in the producing nations. As the price of finished chocolate products soared, the price paid for the raw commodity remained notoriously volatile and perpetually low, often fluctuating below the cost of production for the smallholder farmers who were entirely dependent on the monolithic, centralized purchasing power of a few global trading houses. This inherent instability in the supply chain set the stage for the ethical and environmental crises that would finally force the chocolate industry to confront its colonial legacy in the 21st century. The structural economic dependency and volatility inherent in the West African cocoa supply chain led directly to massive social and environmental crises, forcing a long overdue, painful reckoning with the industry's colonial origins. Throughout the late 20th century, as global demand continued to surge, the price stability for raw cocoa remained elusive. Cocoa prices, traded on centralized commodity exchanges in London and New York, were subject to dramatic swings caused by weather patterns, political instability in producing countries, particularly Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, currency speculation, and the buying power of the few dominant international processors, Cargill, Barry Callebaut, and Olam. Smallholder farmers, typically operating on plots of 2 to 5 hectares, were entirely at the mercy of these price movements, often trapped in a cycle of poverty where they were unable to invest in the necessary farming techniques to improve crop quality or yield. This intense economic pressure led to catastrophic environmental practices. Because the traditional high-quality Criollo beans require intensive shade and specialized care, the pressure to produce high-volume, low-cost Forastero beans encouraged farmers to clear protective rainforest canopy, a practice known as slash and burn, to plant cocoa trees in direct sunlight. While this initially provides higher yields, it quickly depletes the fragile tropical soil, forcing farmers to abandon the land within a few years and push further into protected forest reserves. This relentless pursuit of cheap cocoa became a major driver of deforestation in West Africa, fundamentally threatening the very ecological conditions necessary for the Theobroma cacao to thrive in the long term. The social fallout was equally devastating. Economic desperation in farming communities led to the proliferation of child labor, a phenomenon that tragically mirrored the forced labor of the plantation era. International reports beginning in the early 2000s exposed the widespread use of forced or trafficked child labor on West African cocoa farms, often involving children working in hazardous conditions with sharp tools and dangerous pesticides. This public revelation of ethical compromise at the very start of the supply chain caused a massive consumer and political backlash in the consuming nations, specifically in Europe and North America, directly challenging the carefully constructed marketing image of chocolate as a product of pure comfort and indulgence. This crisis of conscience ushered in the age of certification and ethical sourcing. Faced with the very real threat of consumer boycotts and stringent government regulation, the major chocolate manufacturers and traders entered into various agreements and initiatives, notably the Harkin-Engel Protocol, 2001, designed to eradicate the worst forms of child labor. This commitment led to the creation and proliferation of third-party certification schemes like Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, and UTZ, now consolidated. These certifications aim to guarantee minimum prices to farmers, encourage sustainable agricultural practices like agroforestry, which preserves the crucial shade canopy, and enforce social standards. This movement, while imperfect and often criticized for lacking comprehensive impact, fundamentally altered the transparency requirements of the global supply chain, forcing consumers to become aware of the bean's origin and the human cost associated with its production. The ethical push also fueled a parallel resurgence in fine flavor and single-origin chocolate. Disgusted by the industrial commodity model, a growing movement of artisanal chocolate makers and bean-to-bar producers emerged, seeking to revive the complex flavor profiles of the original, high-quality Criollo and Trinitario varietals, often sourced directly from micro-lot farms in Central America, Madagascar, or Vietnam. These producers bypass the large commodity traders entirely, forging direct trade relationships with farmers, paying premium prices, often significantly higher than fair trade minimums, in exchange for meticulously fermented and processed beans. This movement attempts to reconnect the consumer with the ancient agricultural and processing rituals of chocolate, emphasizing terroir, complexity, and transparency over industrial standardization and low cost. This development effectively segmented the chocolate market into two distinct economic streams: the massive, low-cost commodity market dominating the shelves, and the small, high-value, transparent artisanal market serving the ethically and culinarily informed consumer. This division reflects the current economic reality. Chocolate remains both a dirt-cheap commodity and an ultra-expensive connoisseur luxury, a paradox that encapsulates its entire conflicted history. The final, essential dimension of chocolate's ongoing history is the intense scientific exploration of its health and cognitive benefits, a narrative that ironically circles back to its initial perception as a potent Aztec medicine. Modern nutritional science has confirmed the presence of high levels of powerful antioxidants, particularly flavonoids, polyphenols, in dark, minimally processed cocoa. These compounds are linked to cardiovascular benefits, including improved blood flow and reduced blood pressure. Furthermore, the presence of various psychoactive compounds, theobromine, a mild stimulant and vasodilator, caffeine, and phenethylamine, a mood elevator often released during periods of euphoria, has fueled extensive research into chocolate's impact on cognitive function and mood. This scientific validation has created a new consumer segment focused on functional chocolate, distinct from the pure indulgence market. However, this scientific narrative carries a crucial caveat. The vast majority of studies focus on high cocoa content, unsweetened or minimally sweetened dark chocolate. The benefits are drastically reduced or entirely negated in the heavily sweetened, high-fat milk and white chocolate that constitutes the bulk of modern global consumption. This creates a powerful marketing tension. Manufacturers leverage the health narrative of cocoa while selling products dominated by sugar and milk solids. Nevertheless, the perceived health halo of dark chocolate has driven demand for higher cocoa content bars and cocoa powder supplements, continuing the shift away from the sweet, milky products that dominated the 20th century. The history of chocolate, from its origins as a bitter, sacred currency used to communicate with the divine to its present form as a hyper-engineered, scientifically validated functional food and a source of profound ethical contention, represents a complete historical cycle. We have seen its value defined by scarcity, by colonial exploitation, by industrial scale, and finally by ethical transparency. The bean has been a weapon of war, a symbol of royal power, the fuel of Enlightenment discourse, and a source of catastrophic poverty. The only constant is its enduring, near-universal desirability, a testament to the powerful combination of flavor, texture, and stimulant properties that have captivated humanity for 4 millennia. As the quiet of the night settles fully and the complexities of this long history recede, we are left only with the simple, profound taste, whether the bitter bite of the bean or the sweet melt of the bar, and the profound realization that this indulgence, once so rarefied, now rests universally on our collective appetite and our willingness to pay its true, multifaceted cost. The long story of the food of the kings is finally at a pause, demanding reflection on the immense journey of a small, demanding seed, harvested in the shadows that took over the world. The historical record is extensive, the lessons are deep, and now the time for rest is absolute. The sheer weight of the modern chocolate industry, a system generating over $150 billion in annual revenue, rests upon an invisible architecture of financial derivatives and contractual obligations. A world far removed from the tropical soil and the simple hands of the farmer. This is the domain of the commodity exchanges, where the physical cocoa bean is stripped of its identity and reduced to a fungible, abstract unit of volume, traded months or even years before it is harvested. We must now turn our attention to the behemoth of global finance that dictates the fate of every single bean produced: the commodity futures market. The primary price of cocoa is not set in Abidjan or Accra. It is set on the electronic trading screens of the Intercontinental Exchange, ICE, in New York and London. This mechanism, designed primarily to transfer and mitigate risk, has become the dominant force in the industry, often generating more economic volatility than physical production itself. The futures contract is the essential financial instrument in this operation. A cocoa futures contract is a legally binding agreement to buy or sell a standardized quantity, typically 10 metric tons, of cocoa beans at a specific price, on a specific date in the future, e.g., December or March. Farmers, processors, and chocolate manufacturers utilize these contracts for hedging, a complex financial insurance policy. A manufacturer like Nestlé needs to guarantee the price of the cocoa it will purchase 6 months from now, shielding itself from sudden price spikes caused by drought or political unrest. Conversely, a large plantation operator might sell a futures contract today to lock in a profitable price, protecting itself from a sudden price collapse. This is the pure, necessary function of the market: risk management. However, the vast majority of trading in the cocoa futures market is not conducted by those physically involved in the production or consumption of the bean. It is dominated by speculators, hedge funds, investment banks, and institutional traders who are solely interested in profiting from short-term price volatility. These financial actors buy and sell contracts based on macroeconomic trends, currency fluctuations, and algorithmic signals, often amplifying price swings that have devastating real-world consequences for the West African farmer. If a large fund decides that global economic conditions suggest a weakening dollar, they may flood the market with sell orders, pushing the price of a future contract down significantly, irrespective of the actual quality or yield of the physical crop on the ground. The consequence of this highly abstract, leveraged trading is that the price discovery mechanism, the process by which the value of the physical bean is determined, is heavily influenced by decisions made by anonymous entities in air-conditioned offices, detached from the ecological reality of the tropics. The farmer, standing in their small plot, receives a price dictated by algorithms assessing the global risk profile, not by the quality of their meticulous fermentation or the inherent difficulty of their labor. This is the ultimate triumph of financial abstraction. The value of a physical commodity is overwhelmingly defined by its paper representation. The systemic consequence of this hyperfinancialization is the profound opacity it introduces into the supply chain. Once a farmer sells their crop to a local middleman, the physical beans, now just a bulk commodity, enter a complicated network of grading, shipping, and exchange warrants, all tied to the price set on ICE. The paper trail of ownership often changes hands dozens of times before the bean is physically delivered to a processing plant. This obscurity is precisely what allows the large, dominant processing companies to maintain massive profit margins while keeping the price of the raw commodity suppressed. These companies, which we will examine in detail shortly, are masters of supply chain management, using their immense purchasing power and their sophistication in futures trading to minimize risk and maximize leverage against the fragmented, powerless base of the supply chain, the farmers. The history of chocolate, in this modern financial phase, is no longer about the food itself, but about the masterful, technologically enhanced manipulation of risk and information asymmetry. The quiet hum of the ice trading floor, entirely disconnected from the rainforest humidity, is the unseen sovereign power dictating the economic fate of millions of people. The consolidation of the cocoa industry into an effective oligopoly of midstream processors is the critical intermediary step that connects the volatile financial markets to the stable, standardized products found on grocery shelves globally. Once the raw bulk commodity, the forastero bean primarily from West Africa, leaves the port, it lands in the immense processing facilities owned by a handful of entities, most notably Barry Callebaut, Swiss-Belgian, and Cargill, American. These companies are not typically consumer-facing. They are the industrial leviathans that turn raw, bitter beans into semi-finished ingredients, cocoa liquor, cocoa butter, and cocoa powder. Their grinding capacity is staggering. Together, Barry Callebaut and Cargill process an overwhelming majority of the world's cocoa. In some estimates, over 60% of all beans ground globally pass through their immense machines. This concentration of processing power has profound, often unnoticed consequences for the global palate. Since these giants supply the base ingredients to virtually every major chocolate manufacturer, from Nestlé and Mondelez, Cadbury, to smaller regional brands, they are the unacknowledged arbiters of global chocolate flavor. Their industrial processes are designed for consistency, efficiency, and scale, not for the complex, nuanced flavors of ancient Criollo or single-origin cocoa. The goal is standardization, ensuring that a batch of cocoa liquor produced in the Netherlands tastes exactly the same as a batch produced in Côte d'Ivoire year after year, regardless of minor fluctuations in the raw bean input. This is achieved through massive, centralized blending operations, where beans from dozens of different origins and qualities are mixed, roasted, and processed together. The resulting flavor profile, while consistent and predictable, tends toward a robust, uniform, chocolatey baseline, sacrificing the unique terroir and complexity that defined the original ritual drink. The industrial standardization process employed by these giants involves proprietary techniques that further ensure uniformity. The raw cocoa liquor is subject to intensive industrial deodorization and further Dutching, alkalinization, to remove any lingering off flavors or acidity resulting from rapid, large-batch fermentation, often used in commodity supply chains. The resultant cocoa powder and cocoa butter are engineered to specific chemical profiles that meet the precise requirements of massive industrial clients, e.g., in baking, ice cream, and beverage manufacturing. For example, a global cookie manufacturer needs a specific percentage of cocoa butter equivalent, CBE, and a precise color index, often darkened via Dutching, that will function identically across all its global production lines. The processor guarantees this homogeneity, essentially divorcing the finished ingredient entirely from its origin. This oligopoly structure creates massive barriers to entry for smaller players. A new or artisanal chocolatier cannot easily access the global bulk supply or achieve the necessary scale without purchasing their base ingredients from these giants. This structural reality ensures that even as the bean-to-bar movement champions diversity and transparency, the vast majority of the chocolate consumed by the global population, in bars, cereals, candies, and drinks, remains entirely dependent on the standardized, blended, and financially optimized supply chain managed by this concentrated industrial core. The history of chocolate, therefore, is currently defined by a duality: a small, specialized, artisanal stream attempting to reclaim the complexity of the past, running parallel to a gargantuan industrial river that prioritizes scale and engineered consistency above all else, reinforcing the notion that modern consumption prioritizes predictability over historical authenticity. To truly appreciate what is lost in this massive industrial standardization, we must undertake a painstaking, deep dive back into the science of terroir and the microbial ecology of fermentation, the very process perfected by the ancient Mesoamericans. The word terroir, borrowed from wine terminology, refers to the total environment in which the cacao grows, the climate, soil, topography, and the specific genetic varietal. Just as a Bordeaux grape tastes inherently different from a Napa Valley grape, a bean grown in the volcanic soil of Ecuador, often the prized national varietal, will possess a distinct flavor profile, perhaps floral, nutty, and delicate, compared to the robust, earthy notes of a West African forastero. The final flavor is not merely the result of the cocoa solids. It is the culmination of geological and biological history. Crucially, however, the genetic profile and the environment only account for roughly 40% of the final flavor potential. The remaining 60% is entirely determined by the post-harvest processing, and specifically by the controlled decomposition known as fermentation. This is where the microbiology becomes paramount. The pulp surrounding the beans is an ecosystem, a slurry rich in sugars, citric acid, and moisture. The spontaneous fermentation process is a battle and a collaboration between various microbial life forms. It starts with yeasts, primarily Saccharomyces cerevisiae, related to bread making and brewing, which consume the sugars and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide, heating the mass. As the oxygen is depleted and the temperature rises, the alcohol is consumed by specialized bacteria, primarily Acetobacter, which converts the alcohol into acetic acid, vinegar. It is the acetic acid, penetrating the bean through its porous shell, that is the crucial agent of change. The acid kills the seed's embryo, and the heat, up to 50 degrees, activates internal enzymes, proteases, and invertases within the nib. These enzymes break down the large, bitter proteins and complex carbohydrates into smaller, volatile amino acids and reducing sugars. These simple, reactive compounds are the flavor precursors. They are completely tasteless on their own, but they are the essential building blocks that, when subjected to the high heat of the subsequent roasting process, engage in the Maillard reaction, the same reaction that browns steak and toasts bread, resulting in the hundreds of complex chocolate aroma molecules, pyrazines, esters, aldehydes that define the flavor. In industrial, high-volume production, this critical fermentation phase is often rushed or poorly managed due to the sheer volume of beans and the difficulty in monitoring temperature and oxygen levels in massive piles. This results in under-fermented beans, which yield highly acidic, weak, and flat flavors. The very flavor profile the industrial processors must then use intensive methods, alkalinization to mask. Conversely, the success of the single-origin artisanal movement hinges entirely on the meticulous control of this microbial process. Small batch producers carefully monitor the temperature and acidity, pH levels, of their fermentation boxes, ensuring a slow, even, and complete chemical conversion, preserving the delicate precursors that result in the floral, fruity, or nutty notes specific to their terroir. This return to painstaking, scientifically informed manual labor underscores the enduring truth that the highest quality of chocolate flavor is achieved not through massive machines, but through the detailed, patient management of microscopic biological processes, re-emphasizing the ritualistic care inherent in the ancient Mesoamerican methods. The vast global reliance on the delicate and highly specific ecological requirements of the Theobroma cacao tree is now facing an existential threat that transcends politics, finance, and industrial scale: the relentless, accelerating force of climate change. The cacao tree is a biological specialist, confined to a very narrow, fragile band of ideal conditions, the cacao belt, characterized by high consistent temperatures, minimal seasonality, heavy rainfall, and, crucially, the necessary shade cover. Rising global temperatures and shifting rainfall patterns are rapidly pushing the suitability of existing cacao land beyond its thermal tipping point. Studies have shown that by 2050, vast swathes of current prime cocoa land in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire may become entirely unsuitable for cultivation due to increasing heat stress and prolonged periods of drought. The tree simply cannot tolerate extreme temperature fluctuations or extended water scarcity. This ecological squeeze necessitates a massive migration of cultivation zones, pushing farmers either to higher, cooler altitudes, where arable land is often scarce and protected, or further into increasingly fragile and protected forest areas, exacerbating the very deforestation crisis that the industry is trying to combat. The core historical vulnerability of chocolate, its dependence on a highly specialized, finicky plant, is now manifesting as a profound threat to the entire global supply. This climate fragility is further compounded by the constant biological warfare waged by fungal diseases. Cocoa is highly susceptible to devastating pathogens, notably witch's broom and frosty pod rot, which can wipe out entire harvests. Because the majority of modern cocoa production relies heavily on the genetically homogeneous but high-yielding Forastero varietals, the entire global crop lacks the necessary genetic diversity to naturally resist these evolved threats. A single, virulent new strain of fungus could pose a catastrophic threat to the global cocoa supply, mirroring the historical vulnerability of monocrop agriculture seen in the Irish potato famine. Faced with this dual threat of ecological collapse and biological fragility, the future of chocolate production is increasingly reliant on highly controlled scientific intervention, primarily through genomics and advanced agricultural engineering. Scientists are now engaged in massive efforts to map the entire cacao genome and utilize advanced techniques like gene editing, CRISPR, to develop new hybrid varietals that are both climate resilient, tolerant of higher temperatures and drought, and disease resistant, while simultaneously retaining the complex flavor profiles of the ancestral Criollo beans. This is a multi-decade project to genetically engineer the chocolate tree of the future. A necessary but profound intervention into the ancient biology of the plant. Alongside genetic engineering, there is a renewed push toward agroforestry, the ancient indigenous practice of intercropping cocoa trees with various shade-providing companion crops, such as bananas, palm, and timber species. This not only recreates the ideal shaded microclimate that the cacao tree prefers, but also provides critical biodiversity, soil stability, and secondary income streams for farmers, making their operations more resilient against both ecological and economic shocks. The success of this transition, moving millions of hectares of monoculture back into diversified agroforests, is crucial to the long-term survival of the industry. The history of chocolate has thus arrived at its ultimate technical challenge: the need to genetically and ecologically reconstruct the very environment that gave rise to the plant, in a desperate attempt to outrun the environmental consequences of centuries of human demand and exploitation. The history of chocolate's ethical dimension, its unbroken chain of dependency dating back to colonial slavery, has not been fully resolved by the proliferation of certification schemes. While fair trade, Rainforest Alliance, and other audits have raised awareness and improved farming practices in specific pockets, they have ultimately failed to solve the fundamental systemic issue: the entrenched poverty of the West African farmer. The issue is purely economic and structural. Despite all the certifications and the voluntary premiums paid by conscientious consumers, the global price of raw cocoa remains too low, dictated by the massive, concentrated buying power of the industrial processors and the volatility of the futures market. This failure has spurred governments in the primary producing countries, Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, which together account for nearly 2/3 of the world's cocoa, to take unprecedented steps to assert monetary and market control. The most significant action was the imposition of the Living Income Differential, LID, a mandatory surcharge of $400 per metric ton placed on all cocoa contracts sold by these nations, intended to be paid directly to the farmers to bridge the gap between market prices and a financially viable living income. This move represents a rare, coordinated assertion of sovereign control over a global commodity, an attempt to use state power to counteract the financial forces of the ICE exchange. However, the implementation of the LID has been fraught with challenges, highlighting the immense difficulty of breaking the industrial grip. Large buyers have often counteracted the surcharge by adjusting other fees or shifting their purchases to other, less regulated nations, demonstrating the powerful fluid dynamics of the global commodity market. Furthermore, the reliance on certification creates its own forms of bureaucratic complexity and auditing fatigue for the farmers, who often bear the upfront cost of compliance with stringent environmental and social standards without guaranteed long-term returns. The history of ethical chocolate has shown that consumer goodwill, embodied in the green frog logo or the fair trade mark, is often insufficient to overcome the deep, structural inequalities of the colonial trade system. The core paradox remains. Consumers demand cheap chocolate, yet simultaneously demand ethical sourcing. Since the cost of truly sustainable, ethically compensated cocoa, which includes the cost of agroforestry, full environmental compliance, and living wages, is dramatically higher than the commodity price, the vast majority of the industry continues to operate in the gray area, offering standardized, low-cost products while participating in sustainability initiatives that often address symptoms, e.g., providing schools, rather than the root cause, systemic underpayment. The ultimate ethical weight of chocolate consumption now rests on the individual consumer's willingness to understand and internalize this price gap, recognizing that a cheap chocolate bar is, by definition, a product of sustained poverty. This ethical dilemma ensures that the chocolate bean remains, perhaps more than any other commodity, a continuous living audit of global economic fairness and colonial legacy, a persistent stain on the luxurious indulgence it provides. Looking beyond the current ethical and ecological crises, the final chapter of chocolate's history, the fourth wave, is being written in laboratories, data centers, and specialized biohacking communities, focusing on the ultimate personalization and functionalization of the cocoa experience. This emerging era treats chocolate not just as a confection, but as a hyper-efficient delivery system for personalized nutrition and cognitive enhancement. The scientific validation of cocoa's active ingredients, theobromine flavonoids, has led to the proliferation of functional chocolate bars and powders, engineered to deliver specific health outcomes. This includes integrating cocoa derivatives with nootropics, compounds that enhance cognitive function, specialized proteins, and micronutrients. In this paradigm, the consumer is not buying flavor. They are buying a precise dose of bioactive compounds optimized for focus, relaxation, or cardiovascular health. A complete reversal of the 17th century apothecaries who sold chocolate as a general panacea. The dark, unsweetened cocoa powder is increasingly viewed as a high-value nutraceutical, entirely divorced from the sugar-laden commodity market. The ultimate abstraction is taking place in two parallel fields: precision fermentation and personalized nutrition. Precision fermentation technology seeks to bypass the biological and ethical constraints of the Theobroma cacao tree entirely. Scientists are experimenting with creating cocoa-identical compounds, the pure aroma and flavor molecules, using specialized yeasts and bacteria in bioreactors. This lab-grown cocoa, if scaled successfully, would eliminate the need for land, labor, and transportation, potentially offering a sustainable, ethical, and price-stable source of pure cocoa flavor precursors. This technological leap, however, presents a new existential threat to the millions of farmers whose livelihoods depend on the tree, raising profound questions about the future social responsibility of food science. Simultaneously, the rise of personalized nutrition integrates chocolate consumption into the pervasive digital data stream. Wearable sensors, genetic profiling, and algorithmic analysis will allow consumers to track how their individual bodies metabolize theobromine, caffeine, and cocoa's complex fats. Future smart chocolate will be formulated precisely to match an individual's biometric profile and cognitive goals, optimized for peak performance or targeted health maintenance. The selection of chocolate will move from a simple choice on a shelf to an algorithmic recommendation based on an individual's digital identity and physiological data. A final, complete abstraction where the ancient, messy, biological process of the cacao tree is replaced by clean, tailored, data-driven consumption. The history of chocolate, therefore, concludes its arc not with an ending, but with a profound bifurcation. one reality tied inextricably to the fragile, exploited soil of the equatorial band, and another reality existing entirely within the sterile, controllable realm of the laboratory and the computer screen. The ancient sacred seed, passed down through millennia of ritual, is now a data point, an algorithmically optimized functional food. We have traveled from the bitter earthen cup of the Aztec ruler to the precisely tailored, lab-created molecule designed for peak human performance, a journey that mirrors humanity's relentless quest to simplify, standardize, and ultimately transcend nature. The silence is deep now, punctuated only by the distant hum of servers processing futures contracts and monitoring the bioreactors. The story of chocolate, like the ongoing battle between soil and science, remains in perpetual motion, demanding our sustained, careful observation. The quiet hum continues. The history remains open. The narrative of chocolate's journey, having navigated the tumultuous waters of global finance, ethical crises, and advanced food science, now arrives at its final, inevitable destination. The profound metaphysical and aesthetic implications of its total dematerialization and perfect synthesis. If the history of money showed us the triumph of abstract information over physical commodity, the history of chocolate reveals the triumph of engineered experience over biological origin. The ultimate measure of this abstraction lies in the successful development of perfected synthetic cocoa. Imagine a world only a few decades hence where precision fermentation, utilizing genetically optimized yeast strains in massive, scalable bioreactors, can produce cocoa liquor, cocoa butter, and the full spectrum of hundreds of aroma compounds, from floral linalool to nutty pyrazines, at an industrial scale. This product, grown not in the soil but in sterile tanks, would be chemically and texturally indistinguishable from the finest single-origin beans, yet produced with zero deforestation, zero child labor, zero pesticide use, and, critically, at a price point that undercuts the commodity market dramatically. This technological apotheosis presents an unprecedented challenge to human belief and economic structure. What is the value of terroir, the unique environmental fingerprint, when every flavor component can be reverse engineered, optimized, and synthesized in a controlled lab environment? The historical romanticism of the small farmer, the shade canopy, and the ancient varietal would be relegated to a niche. Historical curiosity for the ultra-wealthy, who might cling to natural, soil-grown cocoa as a relic of authenticity, much like modern collectors cling to gold coins after the collapse of the gold standard. For the vast global majority, the synthetic product would be superior, cheaper, more consistent, ethically unimpeachable, and nutritionally customizable. The emergence of synthetic cocoa would trigger the final, catastrophic collapse of the global commodity price for soil-grown beans, particularly impacting the monoculture forastero producers in West Africa, whose economies are almost entirely dependent on the export value of raw cocoa. This displacement would force a rapid, severe reckoning for Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, demanding massive international intervention and economic diversification to prevent a humanitarian crisis of immense scale. The historical exploitation of the cacao farmer, sustained through centuries of colonial and industrial suppression, would end not through ethical triumph, but through technological redundancy. The age-old economic problem is solved by dissolving the need for the human labor force altogether. This technological pivot redefines the meaning of luxury. In the pre-modern world, luxury was defined by scarcity of material, gold, spices. In the industrial world, luxury was defined by brand and scarcity of access. In the age of synthesized chocolate, luxury shifts entirely to customization and personalization. If mass production yields a perfect, cheap, ethical chocolate, true luxury becomes the ability to consume a bar meticulously designed to match an individual's precise genetic, metabolic, and aesthetic requirements. This is where the functional and the decadent merge. Wealthy individuals will receive bespoke chocolate formulations, perhaps a bar engineered to optimize neural pathways for complex problem-solving in the morning, or a low-glycemic, high-flavonoid evening blend tailored to maximize REM sleep, all based on real-time biometric data fed from their digital identity layer, Layer 3. Chocolate ceases to be a food group and becomes a high-performance chemical interface, the ultimate luxury of individualized perfection. The aesthetic dimension of this final phase involves the complete integration of chocolate into the metaverse and hyper-real digital environments. Tokenized chocolate assets, NFTs representing ownership of a limited edition synthetic blend, or digital cocoa farms that exist only as data, will circulate as high-value, tradable collectibles. Experiences of chocolate will be simulated with unprecedented fidelity, utilizing haptic feedback gloves and advanced neurosensory interfaces, allowing users to experience the melt-in-your-mouth texture and the complex aroma of a billion-dollar synthetic blend without consuming a single physical calorie. The ultimate luxury may be the ability to sense chocolate, fully personalized, fully optimized, and entirely virtual. A sensory experience detached from any biological or geographic constraint. We have traveled from a sacred bitter drink, used to contact the gods and seal human oaths, to an algorithmically optimized molecule, traded on global exchanges and experienced in virtual reality. The journey has revealed that chocolate, in every historical epoch, has been more than a food. It has been a profound lens through which we view human desires, economic power, ethical failures, and technological aspirations. The demand for its unique chemical properties has driven conquest, fueled slavery, engineered industrial revolutions, accelerated scientific breakthroughs, and ultimately reshaped global ecology. The history of chocolate, therefore, is complete only when the physical link between the consumption experience and the ancient, demanding Theobroma cacao tree is finally structurally broken. This break, achieved through the cold logic of synthesis and the demand for ethical perfection, marks the end of chocolate's dependence on the unpredictable, exploited soil. The story concludes not with a return to the simplicity of the beginning, but with the full realization of the potential for abstraction inherent in its bitter, powerful seed. The history is now silent. The demand has been met. The perfection has been achieved. There is only the sweet stillness of the final, synthesized reality.